Uncovering History, The Founding Fathers and Those in Their Shadows, Part 14, The Battle of Brandywine. September 11th, 2001, a day of infamy in modern American history that no one will forget. On that day, America was attacked by Islamic terrorists who hijacked several American aircraft and descended upon New York City and Washington, D.C., killing thousands. Some 244 years prior to the 9/11 attack, on the same day, America was battling for her right to exist. At a creek some 30 miles west of Philadelphia, the Americans would clash with the British Army in one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the war, the Battle of Brandywine. After over a year of war against the British, the Americans had lost far more battles than they won. When the war officially began in New York, the American army was decimated by the superior British forces, losing battle after battle. But after fleeing from the then capital of America, New York City, the Americans took the fight away from the waterways of the British Navy to the countryside. Here, Washington and his men gained a slight advantage over the British and were able to rattle off a string of victories that shifted the momentum back into the Patriots' favor. But now, the British had their sights fixed on ending the American campaign for independence by capturing the new capital, Philadelphia. In early September, moving his army from Elkhead, Maryland, General Howe and the British Army marched east towards Brandywine, which was the last natural barrier to Philadelphia and Washington's only hope of stopping the British from seizing the capital. Leading up to the battle, General Howe dispatched some 6,800 British and Hessian soldiers, led by Colonel Knyphausen, to meet Washington's army at Chadds Ford. It was an unseasonably warm autumn day. As the fog lifted and the sun began to beat down on the American soldiers at Chadds Ford on the Philadelphia side of the creek. Even in the shade, the sweltering heat sent beads of sweat streaming down the men's faces. Here, Washington and his men decided to initiate the action and engage the main British force by crossing over to attack. The creek, which was about knee to chest deep and not very wide, was, however, fast-moving and could only be forded in certain areas. Prior to crossing, Washington had received fairly solid intel that Howe had split the main part of his army so the bulk of the force would attempt to ford the creek further to the north and flank Washington's army. This was a similar tactic General Howe had deployed in New York. The plan was simple: send General Cornwallis and some 8,000 soldiers to march around the flank of Washington's army and hem them in while being harassed by General Knyphausen and his men. By sending a massive number of troops to Washington's main force at Chadds Ford, Howe knew this would keep him preoccupied while the remainder of the army prepared their trap. Not to let history repeat itself, as in New York, Washington believed he knew of all the possible areas Cornwallis could ford the creek, so he reconnoitered several regiments to observe and defend them. Unfortunately, he neglected one area to the north where the American loyalists led the British and they were able to cross unimpeded. Hedging his bets that it would take Cornwallis and his men some time to make it around, Washington decided to proceed with his original plan and attacked the British with a full frontal assault. It was definitely a gamble, but Washington was a gambling man who was willing to take chances to score big victories. However, if he failed, the outcome could prove to be catastrophic. If Washington miscalculated the timing of the flanking British assault while crossing the creek, there was a strong possibility the army could be straddled in by the creek with no escape, as the British would collapse on them in both the rear and the front. Yet again, divine providence must have interceded. because as soon as Washington's men began crossing the creek, gunfire erupted from them off in the distance as Cornwallis and his army had arrived far earlier than anticipated. While they were being temporarily repelled by Captain John Sullivan and Lord Alexander Stirling's regiments, the men would soon be overtaken and desperately needed help. Standing alongside Washington was none other than the Marquis de Lafayette. Having never tasted battle before, the youth was eager to engage. He quickly pleaded with Washington, requesting he and his men aid the overwhelmed regiments from almost certain defeat. Washington obliged. As soon as Washington acquiesced, Lafayette and his two squires, Gima and Lacombe, sped off on horseback to the action. As they galloped through the woods, the roar from muskets and cannons grew louder and louder. Suddenly, they were met by a large plume of smoke and retreating American soldiers fleeing in every direction. Lafayette said, "By the time we arrived, the enemy had crossed the ford." The cannon fire from the British was so furious, the lines had collapsed, and the men were sent running for their lives. In an attempt to stop the men from retreating, Lafayette reared his horse, wheeling back and forth, shouting at the men to stop and form a line of defense. In a moment of desperation, Lafayette jumped off his horse and began physically grabbing the men, trying to stop them from exiting the battlefield. Noticing the general's uniform, the men halted their retreat and began to listen to the instructions given. Setting up several lines to fire back and establish a position, the assault from the British was overwhelming. As much as the men tried to slow the British army down, they were outgunned and being cut down mercilessly. These weren't British regulars the Americans were facing. These were the Queen's Rangers, Hessians, Grenadiers, and Special Forces using fast-loading muskets and cannon fire from high ground. Things quickly deteriorated for the Americans as the fighting escalated to a point where Lafayette ordered a formal retreat because his men were being engulfed by the British forces. As Lafayette was screaming instructions to his men to retreat, Gimot looked down at Lafayette's leg and noticed blood seeping through his boot. He screamed, "Monsieur, you have been shot!" Caught up in all the chaos, Lafayette didn't notice that a musket ball had passed directly through his leg. However, the wound was the least of Lafayette's worries because the casualties were mounting fast. Looking across the battlefield, Lafayette witnessed a gruesome scene as it was littered with corpses and young boys laying in the field, injured and whimpering for help. It was a grotesque scene as the blood stained the entire battlefield. Many American boys and men were crying out to God for help, while the very young were crying for their mothers as they drew their last breath. Desperately needing more assistance, General Nathanael Greene was dispatched to cover the retreating men and help the wounded. By now, Lafayette had lost an immense amount of blood and was limping badly. Gima helped him mount his horse to remove him from the battlefield, hardly what Franklin meant when he wrote, "Let the boy taste battle, but keep him from harm's way." Lafayette had lost so much blood that his face grew pale white, and whatever remaining strength he was able to garner was quickly evaporating. At the same time, while Washington and his men were inflicting casualties on the British, they were now about to be overtaken as Cornwallis and his men began descending upon Washington's flank. Sensing imminent defeat, Washington ordered an immediate retreat of the army. As the men retreated, the gunfire and fighting would not cease until that evening. Many lives were lost that day. On the American side, well over 1,100 men and boys lay dead, scattered across several acres, and still many severely wounded. Those that did not escape death were taken prisoner by the British. The British likewise suffered massive losses, as some 600 were killed, with many more injured. By early evening, Lafayette and his men finally made it back to camp. They were exhausted, and Lafayette desperately needed proper medical attention. Washington, who had become very fond of the brave young Frenchman, ordered his physician to dress the wound and get him proper treatment. Lafayette was also ordered to be under the care of Washington's personal physician in Philadelphia, being escorted by the young French-speaking private James Monroe. By now, Washington had a deep sense of respect and admiration for the devoted youth, but transcending that, there was a father-son connection, an unbreakable bond that was being forged. At the age of 11, Washington, like Lafayette, lost his father. At about the same age of 19, Washington was zealous to engage in warfare, fighting for his country and what he believed in. Washington was also tutored under the British General Edward Braddock and mounted a sensational retreat at the Battle of the Monongahela after the British were overwhelmed by the French and Indians. The realization of the similarities between the two men surely did not go unnoticed by Washington, as Washington saw himself in the boy, a son he never had. Before Lafayette was carted away to Philadelphia, Washington said, "Treat him as if he were my son." Writing to his wife from the hospital bed, Lafayette said of Washington, "His friendship has made me a happy man in this country. When he sent his best surgeon to me, he told him to take charge of me as if I were his son, because he loved me with the same affection." By this time, Lafayette was quickly being hailed as a hero. Even though the Americans lost the battle at Brandywine, they inflicted many casualties on the British, with Lafayette leading the way by making a heroic retreat from a formidable foe. A young leader was born, as the 19-year-old boy who had never seen battle or led any soldiers fought valiantly, risking it all for the American cause, even taking a musket ball through the leg. Not only was Lafayette quickly becoming a hero in America, word soon spread to France about the courage and connections with Washington he had. Word even reached King Louis and other high-ranking French officials who were now seriously considering throwing their hats in the ring for the American cause. By France entering the war, they would avenge their defeat against the hands of the British during the 7 Years' War, in which the French evacuated America. But the French also envisioned substantial financial gain from an American victory. If the Americans successfully ran the British out of the colonies with the help of France, that would open up massive trade and commerce with the newly born country. As letters from Lafayette arrived to King Louis campaigning for the French to join the war, the French were now on the cusp of declaring all-out war against the British and joining the cause.